Alright, time for another DraftPhysics.com, debatephysics.com also, where you can find a bunch of short videos, 5-minute videos, just explaining certain dualities and paradoxes in conventional physics and trying to make it reasonable or rational. And there's lots of evidence indicating it's not reasonable and it's not rational. And I'd like to hear some counter arguments to those arguments. But you can't find anybody capable of doing that. So anyway, I found this Chris Pattison. He's a friend or knows that Perth G guy. So I got to his video through his video because I wanted to do a different video on energy. So they've done a few videos. This guy's done a video on the wave particle duality double slit thing that is pretty easy to dissect as, underthought, under processed, poorly processed. Come on, it's just bad. It's bad science. And the fact that these people won't respond to any of these criticisms or even acknowledge their existence, I think they should have an opposite prize in physics for the worst scientist of the year. Just to commemorate really, really rotten, bad attitudes of these people who claim their science to be well processed, that they have a big pile of evidence and it all fits together and it all works very well. And, they keep making this claim, the most proven theory in the history of mankind and all this kind of garbage. And it's the most unevidenced pile of perverted, interpretations one can imagine, really. It's hard to imagine smart people being so gullible and foolish. But apparently that's what they are. And they're also, again, cowards, because you can't get them to man up and make a counter argument. So anyway, I ended up with doing this video, instead of the two other videos I was going to do, just as I said, this is more immediate, in that it recently occurred to me how obviously flawed Einstein's bent space was. I mean, I always thought it was flawed just because it's one of these undisprovable type theories. There's no way to say their God isn't God, like the magic bent space doesn't exist. It's really hard to prove the bent space doesn't exist. But you can. I didn't realize. You can. It's not so hard after all. And it just has to do with you can't, as Professor Lewin said, nature can't finagle momentum, And the fact is that you have to account for energy in the universe, and they do believe in conservation laws, and so much of their physics demands it, that they can't have it both ways. They can't claim the existence of this non-existent force, this mechanism that causes things to happen, and then not account for the fact that the causes have real conservational impact. That is, they create something that you haven't created a place for it to be circular. The only thing circular is their math, but their physics doesn't fit, doesn't work, the beginning doesn't tie up with the ending, kind of thing, however you want to describe that, but it just doesn't work. It fails that fundamental conservation test, is the point. So anyway, so this guy does this video, and they both did a video about Einstein's blackboard, and before he died, what was on it. And the amazing part was just Einstein. It's the 1950s version of the internet. I mean, his desk was just covered with stuff. There's just, the shelves were not books, but just piles of papers and different things. And you're just saying, that's the internet of 1950. It's a little bit messier than the one we have. So to the negative side, I would argue is that Einstein wasn't. He was still trying to use his abstractions, I think, and trying to rationalize them. And he should have gone back to the more basic photon kind of argument and say, well, what's the real elements here? What do you really have in the universe is you have stuff moving the speed of light, and then you have stuff that appears to have absorbed stuff moving the speed of light. And that's all there is. And all the motion is the only part that's makes anything happen. Nothing happens without the motion. And the motion has to be conserved. I mean, with those simple elements, you can figure this all out. And they won't concede the existence of the simplistic elements, and instead insist that the universe is this wacky, silly, things pop in and out of existence, they get entangled, they do things that they can't do, and it's just so bad. So anyway, this guy's an astronomer more than a physicist, I guess. He's into that cosmological crap. But he did, he has a lensing video, so that'll be worth picking apart. The rest of it is just a bunch of ooh and ah video. Oh, look at the pretty picture. Look at the pretty picture. Sorry, no sale. Not interested in pretty pictures. All right, so so I think that's enough of a contest. So in this video, he has a clip of the other guy talking about bent space. Okay, he's the Perth guy. And so I'm going to try to get both these guys on the hook and see if they'll man up and, try to make some counter arguments to all of these. I mean, there's so many arguments I have made, in my opinion, and every one of them is decisive if you don't provide a counter argument. I mean, all I have to do is say, do you really think it takes 25 times the fuel to move something 5 times as fast? 25 times the fuel to go 5 times faster. Spinning or straight, doesn't matter. Who believes that? And if you don't believe it, then you have to recognize that, there's something wrong with the theory because the theory says so. I mean, damn. I mean, smell the problem. Okay? It's grotesque in terms of this. You have a real duality problem where you can't sit there and say, oh, there's these two forms of energy. There's speed and then there's velocity. And one of them is somehow doesn't know which way it's going, and the other one does. And the other one cancels. Through magical process, it just cancels the energy. I mean, it's such a flaw. Well, anyway. All right, so he's just bringing up general relativity and such. See if the volume's okay.
ER, which is Einstein's most famous scientific breakthrough, and is basically the best description we have for how the force of gravity works.
So it's just amazing. It's not an explanation at all. It provides no mechanism. There's no physics in it. It's just an invisible man theory. It's a gremlin theory, a hobgoblin theory. It's just saying, look, this magical nothing, okay, this spooky force, right? So instead of spooky action, it's spooky force. It's still spooky action. It's no cause. There's just some sort of idea of three-dimensional bending in a it doesn't even make any sense. And it's exactly the same mechanism. I mean, the sun is radiating photons through exactly the same rules, except in reverse. The radiation comes out of something. It's exactly the same. It's just a divergence versus a convergence. And it's the same exact rules, but nobody thinks to say, oh, it's a bent geodesic that's causing photons. No, because we can see the damn photons, so we know, oh, bent geodesic isn't going to be the answer. It's just so bad.
It tells us that it doesn't behave like all the other forces we know about.
So there's only one kind of force. I'll clue you in. See the little stuff up there? Little stuff down there? There's one force, okay? It has two varieties, just like matter. Electron, proton. Yeah, and then neutrons are just an electron and a proton. I mean, do you have a counter argument for that? I mean, do you really think a neutron is something other than a proton and an electron? They've already done this experiment now. We've already figured this part out. So now we're done with this pretending that there's 400 different kinds of particles. There's only 2 kinds of matter, the 2 charged elements. And there's only 2 kinds of force, the 2 electron force and a proton force. They move the speed of light. You put them at a frequency that is a period between them, and you have something called a photon. And then you mess with the pattern, electron versus proton, mix it in a pattern, and that's magnetism. And you have a pretty complete theory right there. But no, instead we have to believe in the wacky, silly nonsense. All right, the strong force. I stick an electron between two protons. What's going to happen? I stick a south pole between two negative poles of a magnet. And then I pull the south pole out. What do you think the two north magnets are going to do? There's no strong force. It's just it's so bad. I mean, that nobody else could think, well, yeah, how do I get, if I want to get two protons really close to each other, how do I do it? Oh, that's right. I just stick an electron in there and I've done that. My job is done.
They all work by transferring particles.
So transferring particles, he said. It doesn't, it's sort of a cheat right there because you don't believe that particles are photons. You think there's some sort of ether perturbation or something, I don't know, some weird force that's, waving, and you can't do any of that consistently because none of the patterns are consistent with actual waves. I mean, they don't spread in all directions evenly. A whole bunch of them go straight and a little bit more going out in the fringes. The fringes get weaker and weaker, nothing like a wave. And yet you talk the talk, but you can't show anything.
So-called force-carrying particles move between things like matter.
So force-carrying particles, why does the force need a particle to carry it? So the only force carriers are electrons and protons. They're the things carrying force. They're the ones collecting it and being moved by it. And they decide what everything else does. So whatever the electrons and protons are doing, that's going to decide what the atom is doing. And so on, and so on, and so on. But the only real universe is the one with the force in it and the electrons and protons in it. I can show you a simulation of that, perfectly duplicating charge with those simple elements. So if you go to debatephysics.com, there's a video called Simulation. And you can see the simple rules, 10 minutes, and it shows you how very simple rules create the undiagnosed function, the function you can't explain.
And when they do, they cause that force to be felt.
Gravity.
So they cause the force to be felt. So that's the key takeaway here. So again, we're doing this simple debunk of any notion that bent space is the cause. And the simple counter argument, the argument I need you people to counter with some sort of relevant argument, all right, is, get rid of that. The fact that what the force is actually doing, the bent space, is making the Earth hot. That the center of the Earth is thousands of degrees Kelvin, and so is the moon, and so is the other planets orbiting the sun, and so is the sun. They're all hot because of gravity. Because not only does gravity tend to move things into it faster, so if it's something that's going fast, it's going to go a little bit faster as it falls into the gravity. So it's always adding momentum to objects that crash into the Earth. And we already know that if something's just sitting on the Earth, I probably should do this in some other color. I wish it was a little brighter actually, but I think you can see enough of this. All right, so this is just, say, the Earth. The molten center is being caused by gravity. It's the simple argument, okay? It's none of these guys are, these people are smart enough to know there's no insulation in the Earth, okay? The Earth is a very good conductor. It's water and metals and, very dense stuff. It's all like molten aluminum, lots of things like that are very good conductors of heat. So we know that the heat's not really going to have a problem in leaking out of the Earth. So it can't be millions of years old heat, okay? Because, if we turned off the gravity tomorrow, all these things would lose their heat quite rapidly. And they're all at equilibrium. That is, they're consuming as much energy as they're releasing, would be the logic. All right. And the fact is in that process, they're stoking the furnace. They have to keep adding fuel, okay, for there to be fire. They have to fuel this engine of thermal activity. The thermal activity isn't free. The Earth can't radiate heat for free. It has to be fueled, and the fuel is gravity, obviously. And so you have to make this argument that why would you even think there was a second law of thermodynamics that's creating some dissipation of the universe's energy into unusable heat, okay, when it's exactly what gravity's creating, is a gigantic amount of heat. So obviously, I'm just saying, if something's sitting on the surface, you can understand it's a constant pressure it's applying. I'm constantly pushing into the Earth. I don't stop. I'm always doing it, and it always has to, in some way or other, account for that. But the real truth is it doesn't account for it in any other way than any energy going this way, okay, has to keep going that way. It can't be fundamentally reversed. You can't undo the energy in the universe. And so what you end up with here in the middle is a huge tug of war, where it's turning right and it's turning left and it's turning right and it's turning left. It's pushing forward and it gets pushed back and then it gets pushed forward, and it has to keep on doing that. And all of that motion is the heat. That movement of electrons and protons, that jiggling, is constant and voluminous in its magnitude, because it's a lot of force. It's a lot of pressure. The pressure gets stronger and stronger and stronger. The deeper you go into the Earth, the more the Earth wants to crush you to pieces. So you can't dig a tunnel like 10 miles into the Earth without having to deal with the fact that you have incredible pressures that are going to start crushing anything you try to put inside of that contains any kind of compressible material. So unless you're using something like water or something hard to compress, you're going to be in tough luck. And the deeper you go, the more and more extreme all of that pressure gets. It's a huge amount of weight on top of everybody. Everything here has got a ton of weight pushing on it from both sides. It's being crushed into an incredible amount of pressure, and the pressure doesn't cancel, so it has to keep moving things, the electrons and protons. Anyway, so you have to account for that. All of that heat is being created by all of these material bodies. Even the asteroids are a little bit warm. They're all being heated by gravity. And where's your explanation for how the heat, the infrared radiation, for example, or the microwaves, the radio waves, how are they converted into the bent space? Because that's when we can have conservation. You've created trillions of joules of heat, and you have to have some explanation for how GR, how your bent space, time, how did the heat get converted into it? When the simple explanation is the heat coming off the Earth is the gravity that creates the gravity on Mars or the Moon. That every piece of energy that comes out of the Earth, no matter how discrete and invisible to us, it's the exact pressure that everything else in the universe is going to be affected by. And we're affected by everything else in the universe expelling a bunch of heat, and that heat, in the form of discrete radiation, is what's pushing us into the Earth. And the simple explanation is that obviously the energy, that goes through the Earth, is retarded compared to the energy from the universe. So the energy from the universe doesn't have to move any electrons and protons. So when the heat is coming in towards us and hitting us, it's not going through the Earth. It doesn't have to push an electron, doesn't have to jiggle anything. And obviously the energy coming from the other side, below me, the stuff in space below me, through the Earth, the other side of the Earth, all of that energy has to go through the Earth before it gets to me. And that's the differential that we're falling in, kind of obviously. And that's a complete cycle. So if you just think of it as the heat just is the same thing. The heat creates the heat. All right? Heat creates heat. Perfectly reasonable statement to make. That, discrete radiation compresses the Earth, compresses matter, and the side effect of that compression is the fact that it re-radiates the thermal energy. The force gets re-radiated, and it's just that it's delayed. It takes a while for it to get rid of all of the vibration energy. And so you have to let it sit, like I say, turn gravity off, and everything then radiates all of the heat it has, and that's the end of it, right? But how can it radiate the heat if the heat's causing the gravity? Then you can't turn gravity off. You have to turn temperature off. That's the key to this whole thing. All right, enough of a speech, and we'll go back to the video.
Seems to behave a little differently though. The theory of relativity describes gravity in a way that doesn't require the exchange of particles between objects.
Right, so, but what is it exchanging then? Because it's going to create things that are going to be turned into. It's creating momentum, it's creating movement, me moving into the Earth, things moving into the Earth constantly, creating pressure on the surface of the Earth, going through the surface, creating layers of higher and higher pressure. It's creating real heat, and that heat will be expelled as real radiation that we consider to be particles moving the speed of light, photons. It's going to create photons. So you have a force that doesn't have any substance, and it's going to create a substance that's going to radiate out into the universe. That's your problem. So explain to me how the stuff radiating, the real radiation of infrared radiation, let's just reduce it to infrared only. All that infrared radiation, how does it get converted back into bent space?
Instead, relativity says that gravity is just how objects experience geometry.
So again, I mean, what? This is a satisfactory answer for intelligent people. It's just the way matter experiences geometry. That's explaining to you why things are moving, is because they're experiencing something called geometry. Now, you don't need any of that to understand radiation flying out of the sun. So you understand tons and tons of particle-like energy is flying out of the sun, and you don't understand that as some sort of position problem, experiencing geometry. But you can't understand the exact opposite process, where you have a field of energy, heat, and you put something in it, and it's going to get heated from all directions. That's not obvious to you?
The shape of space and time. In general, objects tend to move in straight lines through space-time.
Right, so again, this idea that somehow you've changed their path, and there's no evidence of any changed path, there's no evidence of this bending thing. So this is another kind of, it's kind of just a classic argument, so I might as well make it real quick. Well, I'll try to be real quick. All right, so I have previously explained to my audience, okay, it's one thing to do this idea of, okay, I have a cart, the cart's moving 20 miles an hour in a direction, and I throw a baseball perpendicular, okay, at 20 miles an hour. Obviously now the baseball has two motions. It's going to go this way, and it's still going that way from its initial motion. And I could even give it a third dimensional motion, but let's not make it too complicated. And the fact is, the baseball is going to travel the hypotenuse of that equation, and it's going to do it kind of understandably with these two motions being completely independent of each other. So it's just as if it's going this way and it's going this way, and you can't really tell the difference between that and it just going this path. So whether or not it's going both ways doesn't matter, because you can't tell when it is or when it isn't. But regardless, that's what it's going to do. But a photon can't do that. A photon, you can't have a photon have more than one motion. It's a one-dimensional object. it can't behave in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, because then it's going to create hypotenuses that mean it has to go faster than the speed of light. So you can't launch a photon, okay, with an existing momentum in a direction and then give it another direction. So if a photon's moving this way, you can't give it also motion this way. Okay, you can't give it more than 1 dimension of motion, because then you get this longer line to get to the same place. Okay, this velocity will not be the right velocity, right? I mean, that's its real velocity. It has to cover this distance. That's its real velocity at the speed of light. And it can't do both of these different paths in the same time. So it breaks the whole idea of a photon being a consistent object always traveling the same speed, because you've given it 2 dimensions of motion, which it can't have. You can't treat it as a piece of matter. It's a 1-dimensional object. It only can have 1 dimension of motion. You can't do this Pythagorean splitting the... It doesn't have a portion going this way, this way. If it was going this way, it doesn't have a portion going that way and a portion going this way. Photons don't do that. They're not material. So you can't bend them, because bending them would require that they have 2 motions, just like an orbiting satellite. They have to have a motion down and they have to have a motion over, perpendicular. And photons can't have 2 velocities. They can only have 1 velocity and 1 direction. And they can't have, they can't be moving in 2 dimensions at the same time. So when something's emitting a photon, it's emitting something that only goes the speed of light. So no matter how fast you're going, it can only leave you at the speed of light. So if I had a bird in a cage and it was flying around in circles and it can only fly 20 miles an hour, it doesn't matter how fast I'm going. I open the cage, the bird can only go 20 miles an hour. All right. So it leaves at the speed of a photon. And if I'm going in the same direction the bird is, let's say I'm going 15 miles an hour this way, I release the bird going this way, then yeah, the bird's going to go 20 miles an hour. I'm going to go 15. And so the bird's only going to look like it's leaving at 5. That's going to be the fact. Okay. And nobody's going to be cryogenically time dilated. None of that's going to happen. It's all just nonsense. Horrible, awful, terrible nonsense.
However, objects with mass bend the space-time around them.
So obviously what objects with mass do is you hit them with force, and the force has to move through them. So we already know this. Motion moves through a piece of steel at the speed of sound and steel. Everything, can only translate a velocity at a certain speed. You can't hit something with a bullet, okay, and make it go bullet speed. No, you have to convert the bullet speed into its speed, of the mass you're trying to move, and those are the rules. And if you try to move a big object faster than it can transition, that is, faster than it can communicate between all of its parts, like this glass, I can hit it with a very high frequency and shatter it into pieces with a tiny bit of energy. Or I could sit there and put an elephant on it and it won't break, because I give it time to accept the energy, or you end up just fracturing it, breaking it. Breaking it isn't the same as applying more energy. So the karate people prove that already, right? You can apply a whole bunch of force slowly to a piece of wood and it won't crack, it won't break. But apply it, concentrate it and quickly, and it'll fracture, because it can't move the stress through the material quickly enough. And that's a simple rule. You have to apply energy at the speed at which the object can absorb the energy, or you're likely just to fracture it. You're just likely to break atoms off of it, because they're not going to be able to transmit the force to each other. So it's just like the speed of sound creates, sonic booms. because you're breaking, okay, the molecular thing, and now you're going to force things to push into each other in ways they wouldn't if they could just vibrate and spread the energy. You're trying to force them to accept energy they can't pass. All right, they can't spread. And so that's why the energy doesn't dissipate and instead moves probably in more straight line vectors in the sonic boom case, is because you've broken, okay, the capacity of the energy to be spread in other directions. And now you're forcing it to stay in one direction. The slower you apply energy, the more likely it is the energy is to leak in different directions. And the more energy you put in behind it, the more likely it is to stay a straight line. Simple rules.
And then other objects passing by simply move according to the shape of the space-time they're in.
Right, so again, you could make these same arguments for photons being emitted by suns, and there's no need for it. You don't need to do this bent thing. And again, the bent thing in this is kind of, I mean, they're trivially simplistic diagrams that don't really illustrate the circumstance. So they're really such a lie. I mean, there is no two-dimensional gravity, right? Because that needs gravity to work. So if you're going to be honest, you draw this like a vacuum cleaner. You draw a bunch of arrows spherically going into the object like it was a spiky ball, all right? And that's the real description. The sun has arrows going out. The gravity has arrows going in. That's all the difference. There's no other difference between the two phenomenon except the direction of the straight line force. There are no curved lines in real physics. Real physics don't do that. Even something in orbit traveling a curved path, it's traveling in a least path. It's moving this way and it's moving that way. It's moving this way, it's moving that way.
This is exactly why some of the funky-looking arcs...
That's why pi doesn't have any resolution. It's because there's no curved line in real space. So this I love, so that they're throwing one of these lousy lensed images, right? So the math here is wrong. I mean, the dimensions are poor. It's not a perfect circle in any way. And it clearly could be argued that there's absolutely no way the lens could lens a whole galaxy. This is a whole galaxy being lensed here. And the image capacity of the lens isn't a viewing lens. I had one here. I don't know where I put it. It's exactly backwards. It's bending more in the middle and bending less on the outside. Gravity's weak on the outside, strong in the middle. So the lens is bending the light too much and too little, and so all you really can get is a shred. One tiny, just a few tiny little pixels, okay, of an image. You couldn't get enough. You couldn't get all of the image. You couldn't get the brightness of the image. None of that has, Einstein said all this, that it ain't going to work. You're not going to see one of these Einstein-style rings. Not going to happen, because there's way too few photons that you can capture with a gravity lens. So it's just, it's really poor interpretation. And what you could argue, because of the fact that this is a little bit erratic looking, is that this was the byproduct of an explosion, that something blew up and this is what happened to it. Okay, yeah, it's a smoke ring. Is it more plausible if it's real at all? I mean, and part of the argument is that who knows, these images are so highly processed that who knows how what becomes real and what becomes fake, in terms of whether it's just something drawn by the computer, not something that's actual. But you can see these huge. I mean, look at the yeah, you can see that. Look at the distance from here to here and the distance from here to here. I mean, you're talking about gigantic flaws in the symmetry. I mean, really huge. And there's no excuse like it's at the wrong angle or something, because you can't create that kind of distortion. It's as if this part of the ring was further away and this part was closer. It's a more plausible explanation. But anyway, it's just really poor. None of this stuff fits the math. It doesn't make any sense in the sense you can't lens gigantic objects, and you certainly can't capture enough light to see it that brightly. Look how frickin' bright this ring is. You have to collect almost every single photon to be able to get something that bright. No chance. So they don't make any mathematical sense. And yet they'll play the game that it's real. And they'll say, okay, dark matter did. Yeah, there's a bunch of dark matter that created this different kind of lens. This wholly different kind of lens. And somehow the dark matter didn't screw up anything else, though. It just makes lensed images. It doesn't screw up anything else's position. Which is just more bullshit.
And rings in space are actually an illusion. The objects themselves aren't necessarily shaped like that, but the light coming from these objects will bend and warp around.
Alright, so the only way the light can bend, you have to concede, is that somehow you gave two velocities to a photon. The photon's coming towards you, and somehow, to bend it, you gave it a second velocity, which means that you did force it to travel a hypotenuse, a longer distance. So I guess the whole speed of light being a constant thing has to be thrown out, because in some circumstances apparently it's okay to go faster than the speed of light. As long as you're traveling a hypotenuse, it's okay. Because the rule is you have to get to the other location. You have to, if the light's moving across your spaceship, right? Your spaceship is flying at half the speed of light. You shoot a photon, presuming you can even do that. Okay, because a photon is made of multiple elements, in my opinion. So obviously as the ship's moving, your elements are going to be shot at the wrong places. So you're not going to be able to shoot a photon anyway. But let's just say you could make a photon. And or you did it outside the ship. You shot it outside the ship from a non-moving object. And it went through a hole in the side of the ship that's big enough to let the photon through. And the photon's going to hit the other side of your ship. So what's the argument? That the light is actually going to bend? Now, yes, you'll see it sitting in the ship. It's going to look like the photon bent. But obviously it didn't bend at all. It went in a dead straight line. And your image of it is just a lie. Because if you could see what it actually did, you just see that it goes straight across. It's a dead straight line. And all you did was move the target. You and the target moved away from the photon. And because you moved away from the photon, you're saying, oh, the photon got bent. When obviously it didn't. But it has to get to the other side at the speed of light. It can't get to the other side at any other speed. So if you're saying it got bent, then you have to explain how it traveled the longer distance at the shorter distance speed of light. Which you can't do. Because it's nonsense.
Objects with mass on its way to our eyes. This process is called gravitational lensing.
Yeah, it's called that, but it's not explained. It's in any kind of rational way. So they always use this fake notion of calling it lensing when it's the wrong shaped lens. So there's no point in creating this illusion that's like a projector lens, or that it has some kind of consistency to it. Like the lens has been manufactured to have a correct focal length. It has no focal length. It can't do what you're claiming this is being created by. Can't create this image.
This description of gravity as the warping of space-time also describes why planets orbit the sun. Oh,
okay. So why planets orbit the sun? Everything is a moon, okay? The sun is a moon of the galaxy, right? The planets are moons of the sun. The moons are moons of the planets. Yeah, everything is a moon.
Tend to move in a straight line through space-time, but space-time itself is warped due to...
So none of that makes any sense. It's straight line, but it's warped, but it's bent, but it's not bent because it's straight, but it's bent because we say it's bent. Bullshit. It's all just unnecessary nonsense. There's one three-dimensional universe with positions in it. Things have absolute velocities, and then they have relative velocities. So you could have an absolute velocity of 700 miles an hour that way, and if you both have that, and then you go 695 miles an hour instead, yes, you'll look like you're going 5 miles an hour that way. When no, you're really just going 695 that way. It can all be understood. There's no magic required. You don't need to reframe the universe and pretend that that time is a place. It's not. It's just a little silly function. It only exists because things are moving slower than instantaneously. And that's it. That's the only reason why there is time. It's because things aren't going infinitely fast.
The huge mass of the sun, and the paths they follow are therefore curved as well. This is what Einstein showed, that change.
So he didn't show anything, he didn't do anything, he just wrote a little fantasy paper about, well, what if, we pretended that, and then see if how it, and then he had to revise it because the obvious flaws were some detected, and so he had to make excuses and revisions. And it's always been, then you end up with twin paradox stories and, again, all kinds of nonsense about, time travel and wormholes and other crap that doesn't have anything to do with the physical reality. The reasonable theory.
Changed physics forever. His most influential legacy.
Right, so it's just terrible. I mean, it's sad, frankly, that he couldn't smell his own woo. He complained about other people's brain farts, but he couldn't smell his own. In the sense, there's no point in calling somebody else's theory spooky action when his theory is nothing but spooky action. A bunch of motion that you don't account for. Free energy into the universe. The gravity creates a bunch of pressure, a bunch of heat, and a bunch of radiation, and yet there's no explanation how the radiation gets turned back into bent space.
Legacy.
What's the first thing you do when you wake?
Oh, that's unfortunate. Right, so the other guy's talking now. He says, what was he writing?
Here, on his blackboard for the final time before his death.
Okay, so then they're going back to this blackboard crap. So it would have been cool if Einstein had a drawing of force particles, and then he had matter bits over here, electron and protons, and oh yeah, it's just electrons and protons, really. All the rest of it is just talk, okay? There's no real good science saying we have to believe in neutrinos or all this other crap. And the real hard, real stuff are electrons and protons. They're what allow you to diagram what a molecule looks like and what atoms look like and all that stuff. And you're not going to find any neutrinos in those models because you don't need any. Okay, they don't serve any frickin' purpose. All the rest is just junk, right? I mean, the strong force is being created by this gluon thing, this silly idea that there's some particle that sticks to another particle and then shoots a tongue out and sticks it to another particle and then he pulls it in like a frog. It pulls the other particle in. I mean, it's so ridiculous. And how do you fall for that? I mean, some little bells don't go off in your head and say, gee, all of this does not sound like the most proven theory in the history of mankind. I mean, I think the theory that water's wet is a lot better than this shit. Come on. I mean, this can't be the right answer. Just so bad that they, So anyway, like I said, I didn't realize that, I mean, I've always argued against relativity, bent light, all of that stuff, but I didn't realize the obvious. That the Earth is molten, not because sheer, because the moon is creating all kinds of tides in the very center of the Earth and tearing it to pieces, and, some sort of nonsense. I mean, it's insane amounts of energy in the center of the Earth in terms of the heat and the mass. So you have a ton of material objects doing a lot of jiggling about, no doubt about it. And it's not being created by some tension or torque forces. It's obviously being created by the tremendous pressure given to every material object on the surface of the Earth. Every single object on the Earth is squishing the object below it. And the squishing just keeps going towards the center of the Earth. It doesn't stop its motion down. And the only thing that stops it is the pressure gets so high that it creates a counter pressure significant enough to stop any further motion. But it's always jiggling. Always, 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 always. You don't just fall on the surface of the earth pushes you back, and that's the last event. No, you're constantly pushing into the earth, constantly increasing the pressure. The increase in pressure requires that you get pushed back up again, and you just keep bouncing on the surface of the earth. Fact. Come on. Alright, so anyway, don't call that a video. And we'll get to some of the other subjects of energy in the Perth case, and then the double slit with the other guy. Just because he's just saying the same. I mean, he's doing a different kind of experiment with lasers and, looking at the actual laser beams, okay, in smoke. And, we've seen that before. And what they show is that they're dead straight lines, so the lines aren't moving in a parabola. So Professor Lewin will tell you they're supposed to be moving in a parabola. Okay, the fringe pattern should create a parabola as it expands outward. That is, if you move the target outward, it should form a parabola, but it doesn't. Yeah. All right. So it just reveals all of that. There's so many misconceptions and so many distortions and perversions. And that's all they have, and that's why they won't respond, is pretty much because I don't think they have any counter argument. So, prove me wrong by explaining why the Earth's core is molten, and how does it stay molten if gravity isn't fueling that fire. And then explain how that energy equilibrium that the Earth has to be at, it's not getting hotter and hotter. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's getting hotter and hotter on the surface, but that's nothing compared to the internal temperature. And so the internal temperature isn't increasing. So obviously it's dissipating as much heat as, the fuel going in equals the energy coming out. And it's just one step behind is the key point. The energy pushing out is one push behind the energy coming in. And that's why there's a differential. The Earth just doesn't push back in the same time that you push in. All right. And so it can't stop you, all right, from pushing until the future. You can't do it now. You can only do it in the future. And that's not going to do you any good now. All right. So, till the next time and such, and so forth and whatnot. See if we can get some kind of reasonable reply. So far, 50 swings and a miss. I mean, so far, we haven't found 1 ounce of integrity in any physicist on YouTube. None.